The sky over Hickory Glen shimmered a bright, cloudless blue on the day of the Autumn Harvest Festival. Banners of orange and gold fluttered in the breeze as townsfolk bustled around the main street, a charming stretch lined with century-old shops and pumpkin-laden wagons. A faint smell of hay and caramel apples wafted through the air. Laughter and conversation filled every corner, while the clucking of prized chickens and the lowing of well-groomed cattle filled the gaps. On one end of the festival grounds stood long tables groaning beneath the weight of homemade jams, pies, and preserves. Beyond that, an impromptu stage had been set up, where local kids in scarecrow outfits performed folk dances to the beat of a fiddler. Everywhere, people admired massive gourds and towering stalks of corn, hoping to win ribbons for the largest or most unusual produce. Around mid-morning, a stranger arrived unnoticed. He wore white face makeup, dark eyeliner exaggerated his eyes, and he was dressed in black from head to toe, a mime. He began to stroll through the crowds, weaving silently between booths, gesturing at onlookers with animated movements. Some of the festival-goers found him delightful, clapping at his pantomimed pretend walls and invisible ropes. He plucked an imaginary flower and offered it to a giggling child. But others felt something off about him. Perhaps it was the way he never broke character, not even to smile or to nod. Or maybe it was the shifting shadow at his feet that seemed a touch too dark, as though the sun couldn't touch it. By afternoon, the mime had set up an impromptu performance circle near the centre of town. Families paused on hay bales to watch. The mime mimed the act of juggling, yet no one could see what he might be tossing in the air. Children clapped anyway, cheering him on. Then he tipped an imaginary hat and started pulling something out of it. That was when the first strange thing happened. The light in the square seemed to flicker, as if clouds had suddenly drifted across the sun. Yet the sky remained free of any. The wind stilled, no more pleasant breeze teased the flags and ribbons. A hush spread across the festival as the mime continued to pull and pull from his invisible hat. Slowly, a shimmer appeared in the air, like heat waves rising off asphalt. People pressed closer, uncertain if it was some clever trick. Then, with a silent snap, a shape formed in midair, a grotesque quivering thing covered in ropey black tendrils. It hovered before the mime as though he were holding it by a leash. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The mime stared at his conjuration, moving his gloved hands with expert precision, guiding it. The shape pulsed once, twice, and then slithered across the dusty pavement before vanishing into the shadows beneath a booth. Parents snatched their children away, hugging them close. The festival's host, Mayor Rosalie Hightower, rushed to the scene, demanding an explanation. But the mime said nothing. His chalk-white face remained impassive, eyes flitting from person to person as though searching for his next target. Almost at once, the feeling in Hickory Glen curdled. The sweet smell of caramel apples turned sour in the nose. Far across the green, a bleat of terror rose from the livestock pen. People ran to investigate, only to find the animals huddled and shaking. One of the prized goats was missing, just gone without a trace. A thick patch of black ichor stained the ground where it had stood. Meanwhile, the mime pressed on. He performed a silent routine of feeding an invisible something in front of him. Though no one could see the shape, they sensed its presence, a malignant energy that made their skin crawl. The shadows around him lengthened in impossible ways. A second later, a thunderous crack echoed overhead, though the sky remained rainless. Panic seeped through the crowd. The once bustling festival grew quieter as people backed away. Some tried to run for their cars, only to find the road barricaded by twisted illusions. Towering figures that flickered into existence, shifting between solid and spectral. They loomed over the escaping townsfolk, forcing them back. A desperate hush fell. Mayor Hightower ordered the local deputies to intervene. They approached the mime cautiously, guns drawn. He stared them down with a look of eerie calm. With one graceful gesture, hands miming the shape of a box, he trapped them behind invisible walls. Their frantic cries were muted, as though they stood behind thick, soundproof glass. By now, the most elderly residents were whispering old folk tales about a creeping evil that once haunted Hickory Glen, long before it was settled. They spoke of a travelling performer who had, according to legend, bargained with dark entities in forgotten woods. Though none had believed the stories for generations, it all felt too real now. As sunset approached, the festival lights flickered on. The swirl of colour and warmth did nothing to dispel the suffocating fear. The mime took centre stage once more, his gloved hands raised to the bruised purple sky. With each measured movement, the rifts of shimmering air tore open around the square, something like diseased roots or ancient tentacles pressed against the edges of reality, threatening to break through in multiple places at once. Children screamed and clung to their parents. Strong farmers who'd once wrestled livestock into pens turned pale and helpless. The top prize for the largest pumpkin sat, still unclaimed, next to a half-finished pie contest. In the distance, a church bell began tolling on its own, each peal more ominous than the last. And the mime was smiling now, barely but definitely smiling, a faint curve of the lips painted in stark white. In that moment, the townsfolk realised this wasn't an act. Something unfathomable had chosen their celebration as a gateway. An unspoken question gnawed at every survivor watching. Could this horror be stopped, or was Hickory Glen doomed to become a silent, abandoned ruin beneath an ancient darkness? No one dared breathe too loudly as the mime continued his performance, weaving illusions into life, each one more terrifying than the last. What had begun as a day of pride and joy, bounty from the land, had become a nightmare beyond mortal comprehension. The mime's white face caught the glow of lanterns, and in his eyes there was a silent promise that the worst was yet to come.